Hi everyone, good evening and welcome. So I'm glad to have you join us for this evening's discussion on how businesses can walk the talk and also translate their sustainability goals into action. I'm Xiao Wei, the editor for Southeast Asia at Generation T, and I'll be your host. So I'm glad to see so many familiar faces today. So this evening, we've invited 3 individuals to be part of our panel discussion to discuss the growing need for businesses to have more sustainable practices, and more importantly, how being more ESG focused is good for business. So our speakers will also share insights on how business leaders and owners can take their ideas and ambitions to formulate strategies, policies, and action plans for the long term. So Karishma Tulsidas, Tatler Singapore's editor-in-chief, will be moderating the discussion, which will run for around 40 minutes, after which we will proceed to do an audience Q&A before we conclude the session with some closing remarks by myself. Now for some housekeeping matters before we begin. So today's session is being recorded and the video will be posted on Tatler as well as Gen T's web and social channels. This is a closed door event and we would love to see all your faces on our screen. So please turn on your cameras if you can, but please keep your mics muted. So for questions that you would like to ask any of our panelists, feel free to drop them in the chat box below and we will try to answer as many of them as possible during the Q&A. So this is a space where we're all learning, so all questions are welcome. And during the Q&A, if you didn't get your questions answered, you can always reach out to my team, whether it's Laura, Karishma, or myself, and we'll follow up with you on that. The chat box is also open for you to interact with your fellow attendees, as I am sure most of you know each other. So feel free to do so anytime during the session. And we will also be launching a couple of polls, I think 3 polls in total throughout the session. So please participate in them because we would like to know more about we would love to know more about you and also what you're thinking. And finally, if you're posting about tonight on social media, you may tag us at the handles as well as use the hashtags that you see on your screen right now. So I've been talking for, I think, maybe 2 minutes. But before we head into the more serious stuff, I would like to thank our partners for this evening. So the dinner box that was sent to all of you was specially curated by Origin Grill at the Shangri-La Hotel, Singapore. So the main protein in each dish is sustainably sourced and to match our theme and topic for today. So feel free to dig in while we proceed into the discussion, and I hope that you enjoy the food. And of course, we couldn't have done this session without Hsbc. So as a global bank, Hsbc plays a very key role in helping to build a net zero carbon economy. To do this, it's not only reassessing its operations and supply chain, but also helping its millions of clients worldwide to make the transition to more sustainable practices and also lifestyles. So we will now hear from one of their top executives. James Chio is the Chief Investment Officer of Southeast Asia at Hsbc, and he will be helping us to set the stage for our discussion later with some insights on sustainable investing. So James, over to you.
Well, thank you, Xiao Wei. Thank you for that setting the stage. I would want to give a very broad outline of what sustainability is, and of course, how the pandemic has actually reshaped this whole world that we are living in. And in many ways, I think what the pandemic did was to actually splinter our world into 3 kind of worlds. I think one, a more indebted world, and second, a more connected and much more digital world. But also, it brings about opportunities by bringing the world focusing on being much more sustainable. And I want to very quickly, over the next 5 to 8 minutes, go through each of these dimensions very quickly, and then that will set the stage for a more meaningful discussion. So what's clear is that the world post the pandemic has actually become much more indebted. If you look at the debt to GDP for this year, it's going to reach almost 400% of GDP. So whenever there is debt, it's really about borrowing future growth to the present time. And that means that going forward, growth is going to slow down from here. And we are already seeing signs of that, even as we've seen reopening happening in earnest, whether it's in the US or Europe, and also in Singapore's case. The growth momentum, that V-shaped recovery that we've seen in the earlier part of last year and also this year is probably behind us, and growth is going to be moderated from here. And of course, with a slowdown in growth, if we look at it into 2022, what we can expect is that inflation should also normalize despite the next few readings. It's going to be very volatile and high, really because of global supply bottlenecks, whether it's in the energy sector, in the chip making, or even in shipping costs. But I think by and large, if economic demand starts to slow down in 2022, so will inflation. And I think what's very important, the main point I want to bring about is that we are still going to be stuck in this lower for longer interest rate environment. It's very likely that major central banks are still not going to increase interest rates in a big way, really because of this slowing growth momentum. And also this means that with a low interest rate environment, it also actually sets the stage for green investments to actually prosper. Because if you have a very low interest rate environment or zero interest rate environment, any alternative investments that have a higher yield would actually thrive. And I think that is really one of the reasons why we are seeing an acceleration of investments into whether it's green bonds or even ESG investing, really because of this lower for longer environment that we have been in. But also what's interesting is that the pandemic has brought us closer together in a more connected world through the digital means. And I think what the pandemic did was to bring a crash course, almost 100% adoption of almost everyone in the world into digital. And of course, it presents very interesting opportunities in the years ahead. And of course, we are connected through Zoom. It's great, but I think the future is going to be much more exciting, in which the connections are going to be much more engaging, more three-dimensional, more enriching, whether it's through holograms or whether it's through virtual or augmented reality powered by 5G. But also this digital world does actually set the stage for a better future that we could actually kind of build. The cities of the future have to be smarter, it has to be greener, and of course, how we are going to think about cities and in various ways of how the world is going to operate. It's going to be a shift towards much more sustainable energy. It's going to be a shift, particularly even in our transport system, towards much more electrification. So I think that's going to be the future that we're going to see. And of course, with digitization, it also will make supply chains in terms of its carbon emission much lesser than before. So I think that's going to be a very interesting opportunity that we're going to see in the years ahead. And of course, as much as the world came together to fight the pandemic, it also brought the world together to look at climate change, because it's going to be probably a bigger threat compared to the pandemic, and we all have to act together. And I think that action is led by government, but also corporations and individuals like us. And I think what's clear is that there's going to be a green revolution in the years ahead. And of course, with technological advancement, whether it's advancements of battery storage or the technology associated with it, or even the usage of green hydrogen or solar energy, etc., the improvements of all these technology would actually allow widespread adoption in the years ahead. And therefore, I think we are going to be in a very interesting time, really, because in a much more indebted world, it does set the stage for green investments to actually thrive. And of course, in a much more connected world, there will be digital cities built on smart technology that will allow the electrification of transportation that's built on the electric vehicle networks. But also, as the world pushes on in terms of technological innovation, you're going to see much more advancement, whether it's in energy storage or even carbon capture technology that should actually help in the years ahead. And of course, the world is going to be much more sustainable. We are going into COP26, which will hasten action from corporations, from governments. And I believe that the sustainability it's going to be a long-term trend. It's not a good to have. It is going to be a must-have. So with that, I'll pause my presentation, and I think I'll transit into a video, and we're going to have a conversation later.
right. Thank you so much, James, for sharing your insights. So as James said, climate change remains at the top of the agenda for countries, particularly governments. But now we'll hear how the private sector can contribute more extensively to this area. So we'll move on to the panel discussion with our other panelists now. Karishma, our moderator, will take over from here. So Karishma, over to you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thanks, Xiaowei, for the introduction, and thanks to James for the very insightful presentation. I'm Karishma, the Editor-in-Chief for Tatler Singapore. Our discussion today is focused on how businesses can transform their sustainability ambitions into action. On a governmental level, with COP26 coming up in Glasgow next week, there is hope that an actionable game plan will be set in motion to help countries achieve their goals to have net zero carbon emissions by 2060. In Singapore itself, the government has initiated a green plan to be achieved by 2030. This is a multi-pronged approach, and some of the initiatives entail every citizen living within 10 minutes of a park, powering over 80% of all buildings by solar energy, and an enterprise sustainability program that has been set in motion to help companies develop their green capabilities. But honestly, we know that governments cannot do it alone. These ambitions would not be achievable without real commitment from all of us, individuals and corporations alike. So how can we all play our part? We can do so through the companies and funds that we invest in, or even in the ways that we run our companies by implementing actionable, sustainable, and effective green measures. I would now like to introduce you to our other two panelists. You've already met James. He is the Chief Investment Officer for Hsbc and clearly a passionate green warrior. We also have Jessica. Jessica is the founder and managing director of EcoBusiness. She has more than 15 years of experience in media, sustainable development, and ESG. She advises various companies on their sustainable plans and is the published author for Forging a Greener Tomorrow, Singapore's Journey from Slum to Eco-City. Suhan is an architect and has long been a champion of sustainability and has won numerous awards for his work. He is currently the Director of Sustainable Development for a luxury hospitality group and the Chairman of Sustainability at Singapore Institute of Architects. He is also appointed World Cities Summit Young Leader. Before we start, as Xiaowei mentioned, we have a few questions for you, our audience. You'll see a poll pop up on your screen right now, and we're curious to know your thoughts and your level of proficiency in ESG itself. Please also remember to send in your questions in the Q&A box, in the chat box at the bottom of the screen. You can do so at any time, and I will ask the panelists at the end of the session. So while you're answering the poll, I'm going to get started. I'm going to start with you, Jessica, and I really want to address the elephant in the room, the energy crisis in Europe right now. It has demonstrated that we're still very dependent on fossil fuels. How close are we to transitioning to clean energy, and why has there been such a delay?
Thanks so much, Karishma, for that question, and thank you for the invitation to be part of this session today. I think that is a very interesting question. The global energy transition is a very complex issue, and as you've seen from the recent energy price shocks, it's really not very simple. So basically, we have been actually seeing massive investments into renewable energy, and that has created massive opportunities, but underinvestment in other areas, as well as some supply shocks, have actually resulted in the spike in energy prices. And people are saying that if we're not careful, we're going to see a rebound in fossil fuel usage, which is going to be catastrophic for climate change. So I think the reason why it's so complex is because this transition concerns livelihoods and it concerns massive infrastructure that has very long life cycles as well. And I think, though, that the important thing to think about is really where we should be putting our investments in that is equitable and sustainable for the future, and to manage this transition really well. I know that HSBC had been part of a plan with ADB to actually, take over coal-powered fire stations, for example, and actually have a transition of 15 years to make sure that they are retired, but in a responsible manner. And I think that there are many, many ways that we can do this transition, but we need to kind of keep the end goal in sight.
Thanks, Jessica. I'm very curious, Suhan, do we in Singapore right now need to worry about this energy crisis? And what kind of impact do we need to brace ourselves against?
That's a very good question. And I think it must be quite frightening to see that energy retailers have been exiting the scene, in the recent weeks. But I think that, the Singapore government has always put energy security as a very top priority. And therefore, we have a diverse energy supply. I think what's interesting, though, is whether that cost of ensuring the energy supply is going to be then passed on to consumers. And we are seeing that price of electricity has been increasing. But I think that there will be a state of flux in the near term, and then over the longer term, it will be stabilized. And I don't think we should go into any panic, but I do feel that we do need to make investments for the future right now, and so that we can, rejuvenate our grid, revamp our grid, so that we can be able to integrate renewable energy sources along with the transition fuels that we're seeing to get to where we want. So that's kind of like my view on it.
Thanks, Jessica. Suhan, do you have anything to add on to that?
Wow. First of all, thanks for having me here. It's good to see friends in industry as well. And I couldn't have said it better than what Jessica has shared, to be honest. For me, at least in the building industry, I think, energy is something that is quite existential, very much so. And I think the energy crisis could indeed threaten the very existence of cities and so on. And, I'm one to talk because buildings do consume, in their design and their construction and operations, they consume up to 40% of the world's energy, consumption. So there definitely is an avenue for us to optimize, to improve upon. And I think the way in Singapore we see the energy crisis could be similar to how we saw the water crisis back when we had to borrow or get some of our water supply from our northern neighbors. And I think with energy, it's maybe a bit less complex because this is where the law of conservation of energy will come into play. Energy can be transferred, it's neither created nor destroyed, right? So using the right technologies, using the right mechanisms for the exchange of technologies, getting the taxonomies of energy exchange right, I think these are all ingredients towards the proper management of, in this case, the flow of energy. And James, in his wonderful presentation, also shared about the proliferation of technology, especially in recent times, right? All of us are consuming more and more these days. How do we then ensure that our batteries are disposed cleanly, our energy is produced cleanly as well, right? And how do we ensure that in the midst of all this, we're still basically performing our duty as sustainable citizens? And I think it's really a fairly complex combination of all these different factors, right? Are we in trouble? Not yet, right? Do we have any agency and actionables to do right now such that we're not in trouble? I think definitely so, right? And I think that's also part and parcel of why we're all sitting here tonight.
When you say that we have actionables to do, you're talking about us as individuals and as corporations and as the government.
Yes, in sort of a first order of that, because it usually starts from governments and their policies and ESG, in terms of environmental and social governance. So I think, being Singaporeans, the first thing we know is, if it's part of policy, then you jolly well do it. If it's not part of policy, then let's look at how we're incentivized, right? And if we're not incentivized, let's look at how we are disincentivized if we don't perform that way, right? So it sort of starts out from a broader framework. Corporations, of course, would then need to sort of take up that framework, and especially in a way that is, equitable for them as well, before it starts trickling down to citizen behavior, right? On the other hand, the bottom-up behavior the bottom-up movement is also starting to gain a lot of traction. We're starting to see individuals and startups paying a lot of attention to sustainability issues, which I think is mighty encouraging for all of us.
And are there any grants or support that the government is giving right now for companies to be more incentivized to inculcate more ESG values or practices in the way that they run their businesses?
Yes, definitely so. The answer to that would be yes. I think Singapore is extremely, generous in the sense that it does support ideas. It pays for at least 50% or more of most of these ideas. It has a fairly structured, although fairly controlled, but also a structured startup movement, which encourages some of these new technologies to happen. There's a lot of action happening within the institutes of higher learning and the universities as well, in trying to turn a lot of this sort of academic research into something that is applicable to the industries. And through that, I think there are vehicles of movement of, turning research into real action, right? Via grants.
Thank you. James, I'd like to speak about the results that we've just got in from the poll, where we asked our audience how much they know about ESG. And as we can see, more than 90% know do not know much or know relatively moderately well about the topic. So I'm very curious to know, have you seen a rising interest in ESG-focused asset classes among your clients so far? And what are some of the potential returns that ESG investments can offer to these clients?
Yeah, well, I think that's a very good question. I think first and foremost, ESG means environmental, social, and governance factor. It's a way or philosophy of incorporating these qualitative and quantitative factors into investing over and above the usual profitability, efficiency matrices. So I think that's going to be a very powerful tool in the years ahead. And I think investors are recognizing the importance of it, especially during the pandemic, really because companies that rank very highly on the ESG scores tend to manage their companies better, especially managing against tail risk, for example, climate risk, or even governance issues that could actually affect the reputation of the company. So that means that if companies that actually manage their ESG very well, the risk of big negative events on them is actually fairly low. And we've seen that in the data over the last 20 or 10 to even 15 decades, in which 15 years, in which what we see is that companies that rank highly on the ESG scores tend to have higher profitability of around 18% higher than those within the top compared to the bottom 10% of companies that rank poorly on ESG scores. And in terms of stock performance, generally you would expect a lower volatility associated with companies that rank highly on ESG. And also, of course, in terms of returns over the last 10 years or so, what we have seen is that companies that are ESG leaders tend to outperform by at least 1 to 2%, so compared to the general index. So I think there is a strong case that investors are recognizing that when it comes to investing, you have to consider ESG as part of your overall analysis when it comes to selecting companies to invest in for the long haul.
That's interesting. So where do you see some of these investing opportunities now?
Well, I think there are many ways in which investors can incorporate ESG into their investing. I think the most direct approach is, of course, in the past, what investors do is through negative screening, which means they exclude companies in certain sectors such as tobacco or even the weapons industry, which creates sort of a negative externality to society and to the environment. But increasingly, what we are seeing is that investors are integrating ESG into their investment framework, which means that they buy companies that not just score highly on profitability matrices, but also score highly on ESG criteria. So that's how investors are starting to incorporate their investments, whether it's in equities or in bonds. But increasingly, we're also seeing thematic investments, which means that investors are looking at thematic teams that have very strong structural growth drivers in the years ahead, such as energy transition, which we talk about, because those are trends that are going to gain traction, especially as we go into COP26. And of course, there are emerging technologies, whether it's the electrification of the transportation system, or even the new technologies that are pushing ahead, whether it's carbon capture technology, that could potentially be a game changer. So these are the areas in which investors are finding investment opportunities. And I think that these are very interesting themes that will actually, in many ways, allow investors to create an impact around the environment, but yet at the same time be rewarded with higher investment returns.
Thank you. Can we just backtrack a little bit? For a company to say that it is ESG focused, what are some of the criteria that it needs to meet first before it can go to the market and say that, you know, I'm an ESG focused company?
Well, I think there are many, of course, you have to go by the criteria. There is an issue, which is a greenwashing issue, which is actually companies that actually do not meet certain standards, but say they are. So I think that's very important when it comes to ESG investing. You have to partner with institutional investors, asset managers that would actually do the actual due diligence to look through kind of the balance sheet and the books, and also to have a say in how the companies work. So I think that's very important facet, because as an individual investor, it's very hard to kind of assess on your own, because some of the companies might say that they have done very well in the E score, they have done very well in the S score, and they've done very well in terms of their governance. But you can't really verify it, and you don't have the kind of the ability to bring about change even in with these companies. But if you invest alongside a big asset manager like Hsbc, we actually can we do our due diligence. We see that the companies report what they do, and we check it, of course, with our process. And also we have a way, we do sit in their boards, in their meetings, and we try to bring the company towards the direction, because no companies are perfect in all these scores. It's a journey, and of course the direction matters a lot. And of course that's what we want to do as well, to have a say in how they run their company towards becoming much aligned with ESG principles. And I think that's very important when it comes to investing with ESG.
Yeah, it's very true. It's still a journey, and we're all still learning. Jessica, based on what James just said, do you have any advice for anybody who's looking to invest in ESG-focused companies or funds? What would be the top 3 things that they should ask the financial institution that they're working with?
Yeah, thanks for that question. Sustainable finance is an area that we've been covering and working on for a long time, and it's great to see the momentum. And if I can give just 3 things that investors should do, really, is do your research. There's a lot of greenwashing going on, and James had mentioned that earlier. We've seen Deutsche Bank, for example, the asset management arm, actually being investigated by the regulators for greenwashing claims. And what's very interesting is that you've seen banks then relabeling their ESG, investments into something else because it no longer qualifies. So it's absolutely important to do your homework and basically be armed with that knowledge before you decide where you want to invest. And then the other thing is also to be clear about your area of investment focus. I think a lot of family offices and a lot of businesses have specific areas, might be real estate, or might be manufacturing, or might be fashion, and think about where you can make the greatest impact would be one of my advice. I help actually quite a few thematic funds in the region. And these funds typically do well because, they have a very specific mandate, and they go in and they look for opportunities. And what's very interesting that we've seen emerging as well is that in the past, people used to think that impact funds delivered impact, but not superior financial returns. And just this week, Bill Gates was at the Climate Tech Summit, and he said that basically, the next Google, Amazon, Microsoft is going to come from climate tech. And basically you are investing not because you want to solve a problem, but because there's massive opportunity. So really think about what's your area of investment focus. And then the last one really is to measure the impact, because if you don't know how to measure the impact, chances are you're really not making an impact. And you have to be very clear about the metrics, whether it's carbon, ton of carbon saved per dollar invested, or is it health and education access, or is it financial inclusion? Is it circular economy? Is it food and agri-tech? Be very clear about how you want to measure the impact of your investment dollar, because as James had shared in his presentation, it is now the opportunity to actually put your wealth to good use. And people are expecting, high net worth individuals and companies to do so. So I think there's a huge opportunity here.
Thanks, Jessica. Suhan, James, do you guys have anything to add to that?
Yeah, whereas about 100 years ago, we saw globally, the race to space and to basically look beyond what's outside of our planet. I think the challenge of this generation, and indeed the entire century, is to look at how to salvage what we have within this planet. And very often, in the sustainability field, we're called tree huggers, we're called all sorts of things. But the truth is, even if we don't do this right, even if we don't salvage the planet in this case with its energy, food, waste crises, water crises and all, the planet will survive. It's just going to survive without us. So ultimately, we're still trying to save ourselves. And I think there has to be multiple different currencies of looking at how we're going to save ourselves. Certainly, finance is one of them. Indeed, with James being in this room, I wouldn't dare to venture otherwise. But there are multiple other currencies and metrics of measuring how well we're performing as an entire generation, right? And that could be, how much of the planet we're actually saving, what our carbon footprint actually is, right? How much destruction are we minimizing? And all, doing that while still leading again, an equitable and a minimum sort of level of quality of living. So trying to preserve our lifestyle while, keeping the planet safe and equitable for everyone. That's I think the biggest measure of ESG.
Thank you. James, anything else to add?
Yeah. Well, I think there is no one silver bullet that's going to solve the climate crisis. What's clear is that from the recent report by the United Nations is that climate change is going to happen whether we like it or not. But if we still have a chance to manage it if all of us come together. So it's from the investor to want to buy into ESG or impact funds, from the corporations wanting to become carbon neutral, from the governments pledging and being serious about their carbon neutrality plan. So I think it's going to be something that involves everyone. Everyone can do their part, big or small. And of course, I think that's going to be really the message. We just can't hope that the carbon capture technology is going to save the world. It's going to be everything, every part of it to make that difference, from even the accountants coming up with the ESG standards. It can be engineers thinking of ways to solve the problem, and of course, even tracking carbon emissions, etc. So it requires everyone to come together and put our minds together to solve this very, very complex problem. But I believe that if we all come together, we can actually manage this issue and I think create a better world for the generations ahead.
Yeah, and that's why we're here today. So hopefully we can at least take that little small step towards achieving a better, more equitable world. Before we go ahead with the next session, with the next question, we have one more poll for the audience. Can we please launch it? So as the results are coming in, I want to ask all of you actually, what are some of the most exciting sustainability trends that you've seen emerging in the past year or so? James, maybe you can go ahead.
Yeah, well, I'm just looking at the poll questions. It seemed like people are thinking that sustainability and sustainable.
Sorry, we can't hear you, James.
Well, I'm just.
Can't hear you.
I'm just looking at the polls, and I think the results show that most people believe that.
We still can't hear you. Sorry.
Hello.
Sorry.
Karishma, we're hearing James.
Yeah, I can hear James too.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Yeah. So I think the trend is, again, there is a realization that sustainable investing is going to be much more important in portfolios. I think really because of how the pandemic has kind of brought everyone's attention towards sustainability. And of course, people are recognizing that it's no longer just a good to have or just doing good, but people are also realizing that sustainability, as even how Jessica talked about it, also it does actually create opportunities and actually gives investment returns, particularly in areas such as climate technology, for example, which is going to be kind of a game changer if we can actually innovate and find climate solutions, whether it's carbon capture solutions to reduce pollution in oceans, or even related to the circular economy. So I think there are many dimensions that sustainable investing can take place, and I think these are something that all investors are getting very excited about.
Thanks, Jessica.
Yeah, I think James has said it all. Sustainable investing is a very exciting opportunity right now. But if I can speak to a question that I saw, what are the challenges of increasing ESG investments? I think that, the opacity perhaps of the knowledge is sometimes a challenge. And I think that if we want to be investing in it, then we also have to have more transparency. And so you see this twin movement of ESG investing becoming more mainstream, but then the disclosure and transparency part also, this movement growing. And I think it's very crucial to have the information, the ESG information, so you can actually make the right investments. And I think in Asia, it has been said that we're the most rapidly growing region. And also this is where the most opportunities are in terms of a young population, rapidly digitalizing, and also having that opportunity to leapfrog some of the legacy infrastructure that other developed countries face. And so I think there's, a lot of, areas areas that investment dollars can go in, and it's to really do your research and your homework in this.
Thanks, Jessica. Suhan.
Yeah, I mean, given my history with stocks and shares, I wouldn't venture to call myself a financial analyst by any chance. But maybe I think from the infrastructural / the built environment sort of perspective, I think there's a lot to be said when we start designing our environments to inherently be sustainable. And by that, I mean being low carbon and encouraging sustainable practice. Doesn't necessarily mean that every single building needs to have a hanging garden or a sky garden or vertical walls. But I think the creation of sort of healthy, low energy type of environments indeed is possible, and it encourages a certain kind of behavior as well, right? Just as our cities define our culture and our heritage, so too our buildings and our infrastructure could define our sustainability and sustainable habits. So, and maybe I'm hopeful that this also answers Joel's question in the chat. What are the biggest action-based opportunities we can act on as practitioners, right? It's really about crossing the different disciplines. So you're not really strictly just doing architecture if you're an architect, not just purely doing construction if you're in construction, but understanding where all your products and so on could come from, minimizing the amount of carbon that goes into their production, their movement, and ultimately their end of life disposal as well. All the better if it can be sort of upcycled into something else. So every single action we do, we're playing a part in the entire carbon cycle, right? Literally from the point in time when we breathe, right, to the point in time when we're using certain products, from the point in time when we switch on the lights. So all these do have agency on the entire carbon cycle. So minimizing that and encouraging a built infrastructure that encourages that kind of behavior, I think that's super important. And again, going back to the point where, again, in Singapore, if it's not incentivized, we tend not to do it, right? If there's no penalty or fine for it, again, we'll tend not to do otherwise. But just inculcating this sort of behavior such that it becomes encouraged, it sort of snowballs into a behavior and activity that actually becomes incentivized. Someone can make an enterprise or a business out of it, right? That would be encouraging, I think, positive carbon behavior, positive sustainability behavior. And I think I'm certain there are many out there who are sitting, at their desks, government scholars maybe, or industry experts maybe, just looking at ways of enterprising, sustainability, right? And how that can be turned into a possible economic wheel as well, right? And yeah, I mean, that's what I've got for now.
Oh, it could be the next Greta Thunberg in Singapore, hopefully.
Maybe. So
you spoke about companies building from scratch and being more sustainable in the way that they build, the way that they operate. But what about companies right now that have had long legacies and that are looking to inculcate these values or these practices into their businesses? Many believe that it adds an additional financial load to the company. Can we debunk this myth? And why would it actually benefit them in the long run to do so? So, do you just want to continue?
Yeah, I'm sorry, you broke up for a little bit. I'm just wondering what the gist of the question is. Sorry about that, Karishma. Lost you for a bit.
No worries. I'll just repeat it. Mm-hmm. I was saying that a lot of many believe that going sustainable might add an additional financial load to the company. Mm-hmm. And how can we debunk this myth? And how could it actually benefit companies in the long run to go sustainable?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. A question that we do get asked a lot in the building, development, and design industry, because if we are, for example, just take a local example, if we take a building, we want to make it Green Mark Platinum, let's say, right, because that could be a requirement for a particular plot of land by the government. The question we always get asked is, so what's a premium we have to pay, right? So upfront, your CapEx could increase anywhere between 3 to 5%, and you're working out your numbers on your calculator and you're going, I'm not even going to see the results or the benefits of these savings, because at the end of completion of the building, we're going to sell it. Someone else is going to occupy it. And the people who are going to save from our efforts and our investment are basically the MCST, right? Or the building operators and so on. And very often this conversation then comes up. So what then would be the buy-in for someone to actually invest more in sustainability? So there are a couple of different mechanisms, one of which, of course, is legislation, right? If you don't hit these certain performance requirements, you're not going to get your building permit, right, to occupy within, right? And if you take that sort of example and slap that onto every single industry, there is a lot of, I think, effect that policy can actually have, as long as, and going back to the earlier point that Jessica made, as long as we get the metrics and the measurables right? But we're already living in a very prescriptive society, right? Case in point, why 2 people dining instead of 3 or 4 or 5? I won't go into that necessarily, right? That's another hour of conversations, but it has to be a means where the performance-based aspects, in this case, either the performance of the building, performance of the fund, the potential sort of social behavioral changes that something could bring, right? All these could in fact be simulated, be quantified, and then be laid out as use cases, right? So is that cost therefore justified, right? I mean, there is a point to be made about corporate social responsibility, right? But there's also a point to be made about investing for the future, in that whatever you're putting up front will save you a lot of costs over time, right? And that could either be operational costs or corrective costs and so on. Going back to the old adage, a stitch in time saves, how many was it again? 9, right? So yeah, I think if we go by this sort of policy, if we anticipate life cycles of products, of buildings, of everything that we go through, right? That could be the answer of this whole question.
Thanks, Yuan. Any additional comments, Jessica or James?
Yeah, actually, if I can just build on Sihan's point, I think that you risk becoming obsolete. I mean, we've talked a lot about the opportunities, but there's also a cost to inaction. And there's this concept of stranded assets, in this whole conversation. Are you investing in infrastructure or an investment that would be stranded in the future years, and therefore you lose all your investment value? Are you becoming irrelevant because you haven't kept up with the times? I think companies, investors as well, we want to be part of the problem and not, we want to be part of the solution and not part of the problem. And I think it's very important to understand that there are penalties as well. I mean, just to take the EU, for example, they're introducing this concept called the cross-border tax adjustment, which means that if your country doesn't have a carbon tax, but you want to do business with the EU, then you're going to have to be facing a carbon tax penalty. So if you're looking at your own supply chain and your own operations, and you haven't thought about what is the cost of your emissions to your business, then when you face a very competitive global landscape, you stand to lose. So I think that there's also, the risks and opportunities, and we have to be quite holistic in the way that we look at it.
Yeah, if I were to add, I think it's really the incentive of all companies to embrace ESG. Just take environmental factors, for example. It's very clear that climate change is here, and of course there are going to be more frequent floods, etc. We've experienced it in Singapore, and therefore I think companies have to, let's say running an operation, have to take account all these climate change effects, so that their supply chains are actually flexible enough to cope with these exigencies, which are becoming much more frequent. So this is almost like adaptation to the climate changes that's going to happen. So of course, companies that look at these things would tend to do better than those that ignore these factors, because it's going to be real. It's not just mitigating climate change effects, which also can be rewarded in future, especially with carbon credits. You can get rewarded for being much more carbon conscious in that sense. So I think it's no longer a kind of good to have for companies. It has to be a must have. And of course, the consumers recognize it. They reward companies that are much more sustainable. And importantly, investors recognize it. And investors would now very much almost invest only in companies that are sustainable. So you have your customers and investors both requiring it. And of course, it's good for the business. So there is no contradiction between purpose and profits. And I think that's going to be a very strong message in the years ahead.
Yeah, I think that's very important to know. Let me just, so we asked the poll earlier, but is sustainable investing going to be an important consideration in your portfolio? And about 75% of the respondents said that yes, it is. So James, given that we have you already, I'm very curious to know, how is Hsbc supporting its clients to incorporate ESG in their operations or in their investment portfolio?
Yeah, I think we are helping clients in this whole ESG journey on multiple dimensions. I think with business owners, we are speaking with them of how to start off with an ESG framework, for example, in how they run things. And of course, it's not a complete change overnight. It's the direction of change towards whether they could be much more conscious in how they manage, mitigate their carbon footprint, for example, or even in how social indicators within their workplace, diversity indicators, etc. And so it's a journey that we help. But of course, what's important is also in our side in terms of the investments, in which we are actually providing, helping clients incorporate ESG into their portfolios. So we have kind of portfolios that are 100% ESG kind of managed, in which we only invest in companies that meet a certain ESG standards. And so that's how we help clients to invest, basically having a portfolio that is 100% aligned with ESG principles. But of course, right now, over and above that, many investors, as how Jessica has mentioned, that they are very interested in teams, climate technology teams, green tech, for example. They're very interested in renewable energy, for example. They're very interested even in smart building technology that actually reduces the carbon footprint. So there are many ways in which investors want to be part of this whole sustainability journey. And I think we at HSBC are very happy and proud and want to partner our investors along this journey with them.
Thanks, James. We're getting a lot of questions actually in the chat box. So I'm just going to start by asking some of them. So Sonia's saying, I'm going to read out her question. She says, I'm still wrapping my head around how the tree hugging movement in the 1990s evolved into ESG today. A part of me agrees that money will always attract attention, and perhaps ESG is finally the solution. But a part of me definitely wonders if this is all too good to be true, and that it is all hype and hyperbole. Jessica, I am aware of the Eco-Business as the newsletter for green businesses for more than a decade. Perhaps you witnessed the evolution. What happened? For the panel, is ESG too good to be true? Jessica?
Thank you, Sonia, for that question. It's very interesting. And yes, I think ESG and sustainability has moved from the fringes, and it used to be something that was from the tree hugger movement, what they call the lefties. And that's moved, very firmly into the center, not because of a tree hugging movement or suddenly everyone discovered their love for nature. And I think that over time, we have seen that climate change really is a problem, and the science is behind that. And therefore, you see ecosystems all over the world reaching tipping points. And I think, the one quote that always struck me, one of my favorite documentaries is a WWF Netflix documentary, is there are no jobs on a dead planet. And I think if all of us are business owners and we all, want livelihoods, good quality of life, we have to not ignore the fact that our climate is in crisis. And it's therefore because of this evolution of the issue that ESG and sustainability has evolved. And in the past, it used to be kind of regarded as CSR, right? And that is like charity, and you write a check and you do good, do well by doing good, and you give back to the community. Give back, that concept is completely outdated now, because it implies that you're plundering and exploiting and then making up for it after that. Whereas now I think everybody expects your businesses to be responsible, to uplift communities, to ensure that environment and social protection is embedded into your entire organization. And therefore, we see now that this is really mainly a business case. At a recent sustainable finance event that we staged, my favorite quote that came out of that from one of our speakers is, all finance should be sustainable. There shouldn't be a head of sustainable finance, sorry, James, but it should be all finance is, being channeled basically to investments that are equitable and sustainable for our future. Otherwise, we are not going to get where we need to be. So I think very interesting question, and thanks for that.
So is ESG too good to be true? Suhan, you look like you're ready to answer.
No, I'm really just breathless trying to take in all that Jessica has just said. It's Jess is an old friend, and as in a long-time friend. We're not old by any means, but Jess is a constant stream of consciousness, and especially in all things sustainability. And with that, I've just bought enough time to look for an answer. And it's really, I wish it were more hyped and hyperbole, the same way that space travel or space tourism is now hyped, in the same way that, what is the next biggest thing? I don't know, guacamole on toast, right? I wish it were hyped any millennials amongst us? I wish it was hyped in the same kind of way, because that will draw a lot more attention to it. And with a lot more attention, a lot more investment from both a marketing as well as an executive point of view. And ultimately, all this hype will pay off, because indeed it is to preserve our livelihoods on the planet, right? No jobs on a dead planet, right? Someone wise once told me a couple of minutes ago. So ESG is too good to be true as a concept. I wish it is more hyped. I wish there is more attention and focus and financing that's given to it. But with one big asterisk, and that asterisk comes with the disclaimer that it has to be measured in, I suppose, in equitable terms. It has to be measured in the appropriate terms for appropriate communities, because we all don't go by the same yardstick, right? Depending on where we are on this planet. So maybe it's about time we have, sort of newer agents of sustainability, in the sense that they're no longer the leftist tree huggers, although they could be lefty as well. They, move them to the right of the center, right? So it becomes the norm or the established norm for people to become ESG experts. Bring in your DiCaprios, bring in your, who's the latest UN person now? BTS, all these guys. Blackpink, yeah. Names that fly right above my head, but bring them into the conversation. Give a lot more awareness globally on what's happening. Bring in these ambassadors and ensure that they perform right and ensure that they do right. Yeah, and I think it is therefore our jobs to carry on, all that good work.
I think we need to sexify ESG. James, do you have any?
Okay.
James, any comments?
Well, I think it is for real. It's clear that finance banks are very serious about it. I think at Hsbc we have pledged for all, not just for our own operations, to be carbon neutral by 2030, but for all our customers to be carbon neutral by 2050. That's a big statement to bring about that change. And of course, in the short term, it also would mean for us losing some opportunities as well as we make this transition. So it is serious, and of course we are part of many working groups to make all these things real. So it includes coming out with global standards, accounting standards. It includes coming out with ways of data. How do you track companies that profess to do certain things? Coming out new technologies to track carbon emission, for example. So we are at the forefront of trying to make all these real, and I think we are at the frontier of doing all this. And I think it's going to be, while we don't have the perfect solution as of now, but I think the direction is correct, and I think that's going to be the trajectory in the years ahead.
I think this is a good lead-in to what Shabnam is asking as well. She's asking whether you think that ESG will become part of legislation in the near future. Anybody want to take it up?
It already is, actually. If you look at the EU Sustainable Finance Taxonomy, it set out very clear guidelines on what is considered sustainable investment. And that's going to influence actually all investment in the finance industry massively. If you look at New Zealand, I'm a big fan of Jacinda Ardern. She's actually mandated that all the banks and financial institutions above $1 billion revenue now have to disclose according to the TCFD framework, and that's the Task Force for Climate-Related Disclosure. And this is really like kind of putting a scrutiny on the transitional risk, financial risks, and physical risks that institutions face. Because by understanding the risks that you face, you're more likely to take action. And so we're actually seeing ESG legislation already increasing. And it might not be called ESG, it could be things like EPR, which is the Extended Producer Responsibility legislation. Singapore has instituted one. There's one going to be happening in Vietnam soon. And it's really about how can we be responsible stewards of our resources. If you look at carbon tax, Singapore is the first ASEAN country to put in a carbon tax. Apparently it's going to be raised in the next budget, which will be very exciting, but it shows you that actually legislation is already happening. So how can companies, how can investors, how can business owners keep ahead of the regulatory landscape rather than play catch up? I think it's an important question.
So we have sorry, anything to add, James?
Right, so that was me actually.
Sorry, yes. Go ahead.
I was going to say before the thought skipped my head that there are also policies that are sort of related, right, to ESG policies, and they typically come in 3 letters. I think the first 3 letters that come to mind is COE or RCOE and ERP and all these things that try to dissuade a certain type of behavior and ultimately leading towards a more sustainable kind of goal. And well, I shouldn't be saying that because I love cars and I love driving, but I guess the ways of persuading behavior come in so many different forms, right? Whether or not they're directly ESG related or simply offshoots of ESG sort of driven policies, right? And again, if there are ways of actually disincentivizing non-sustainable behavior, or in this case, ESG literally as the enterprise Singapore point of view as well. Here's a little distraction. I was in an ESG forum for I think a couple of weeks ago. It was Switch, I believe. And for the longest time, I thought the ESG that the moderator or the person was referring to was actually Enterprise Singapore when it was environmental and social governance, right? And the fact is, nobody knew that I didn't know. And it was masked so easily because enterprise and sustainability in this case, they're almost interchangeable, right? Which is quite telling. And it's telling because the moment you can turn sustainability into an enterprise, you're going to get all sorts of legislations. You're going to get all sorts of policemen surrounding your practice and your business, right? Just as you would get an equivalent number of investors, hopefully, waiting at your back door.
I just had a meeting with Enterprise Singapore this morning. It was very confusing, ESG and ESG. So I know what you mean, Han.
Yep. So here's a note for anyone who wants to rebrand their organization. The three letters that don't already exist.
So we have one more question from Liling, actually two questions. What was the effect of COVID-19 on sustainable investing? And secondly, what are the main challenges to continued growth of sustainable investing? James, maybe?
Yeah, I think one of the impact of COVID-19 on sustainability, I think number one is also, first, it created kind of a low interest rate environment. And I think it sets a kind of a very fertile ground for green investments to grow. Because if you imagine in a world of very high interest rates, certain bonds have to be raised at even a higher level. So in that sense, a low interest rate or zero interest rate environment does actually create an incentive for green bonds, for example. But also, I think what's very important is that the pandemic also has created a realization that as much as we all can come together together to fight the pandemic, we can also come together to fight climate change. And I think that realization has kind of made it become a reality. I think that's very important. And of course, how do we go about to fight this kind of a big complex issue? I think that's going to be something that would actually gain traction in the years ahead. And all of us can do our part, whether it's investors, whether it's business owners, to make that change, to look at how we view ESG, and of course, how do we move along the direction of trying to become much more sustainable.
Thanks.
I can add, actually, I think the link between COVID-19, the pandemic, and sustainability became very, very clear. And, zoonotic diseases have been on the rise, but it hasn't exploded in this kind of scale until COVID-19. And zoonotic diseases really came out of deforestation and basically this proximity between humans and wildlife, which in the past wasn't as prevalent as today. And our irresponsible management of resources actually led to COVID-19. And I think the other interesting thing is that, people say that COVID-19 actually is a dry run for the climate crisis. Bill Gates have estimated that actually the economic damage wreaked by climate change will be 10 times that of COVID. And it's kind of inconceivable because the last 2 years have been so unprecedented for all of us and in the way all our lives have changed. And to think that climate change is an even more serious threat and that we are also waiting for disease X, which they say would be worse than COVID-19 and which could happen at any minute if we continue to, exploit, our current ecosystems. And I think this point cannot be labored more because I think it's not some big calamitous event like some flooding that will befall Singapore, which is unlikely to happen. But it's really the slow destabilization of society, the mad scramble for resources, and these kind of long-term trends that you see that is going to create a very unfavorable environment for business. And I think as businesses and as investors, we need to think about the long-term trajectory of our society. And therefore, that's why we should take action today. And I think that that's still, for me, the most compelling reason.
I had to Google zoonotic diseases, and noun, it's a noun. It's an infectious disease that is transmitted between species of animals or from animals to humans. The things you learn.
So we have
help.
So we have time for one more question, and Nana is asking, does sustainability increase profit? Maybe you can get some insights from all of you. Jessica, do you want to start?
Yes, I would say definitely. I think in the past, the link wasn't so clear, but James mentioned in his presentation, the ESG linked stocks, equities, PE assets. I mean, all of them have demonstrated that they are more resilient and they are also more sustainable. And so I think that the direct answer is yes. Sometimes in the transition, it can get quite complex and people say, well, you know, I can still invest in oil and it'll make a lot of money today. How long that is going to last is the big question. And in fact, we've already seen that the fossil fuel industry is in decline. So I think we need to be very mindful into the industries that we're putting our investment dollars in, which ones are sunrise, which ones are sunset, and you know, where do you want to be in that whole entire spectrum? So I think yes is definitely the answer.
Well, yeah, that's from someone who comes from a company called Eco Business, so it's inherent in their name. I'd agree, to be honest. I'd agree. My answer to that would be, it depends, right? Just like my answer to everything. And it does depend on, I think, the way it is conceived, the way it is executed, and the way it is, the way profits are being reaped from them. There is every single risk of greenwashing that's happening, and we see that happening a lot in a lot of so-called sustainability or sustainable type of industries, which inherently expend even more carbon than what they actually save, right? So again, the watchdogs of the world will need to sort of sit up and take notice. Press and media being a very, very good channel of that. I think pre-eco business, and I'm not doing this because Jessica is my friend, but pre-eco business, the ability to actually report malpractices and the ability to call out, you know, greenwashing was a lot lower, simply because there wasn't so much of an avenue to do it, right? So I think profitability also needs to come with a certain consideration of impact on community, impact on ecosystems, and I think impact on livelihoods. So yeah, it still depends. Oh, yes, yeah. Okay, now we can't hear you, James.
Yeah, James, I think you're on mute.
I don't want to again.
Okay, now I'm mute. How I'll answer it is that I think in a post-pandemic world, it's definitely going to be much more uncertain. Why is that so? Because first we have the world is still not fully out of the pandemic yet. And what the pandemic does is also to kind of create a lot of income inequality in many societies around the world. And of course, that would create much more social fractures of sorts. And if you couple that with climate change, for example, which is going to affect many countries, cities adversely. So it's going to be a very complicated and complex world. And if companies do not embrace ESG factors, or let's say companies ignore ESG factors, they can't thrive in such an uncertain world. So I answer it in the other way. So it's very important, therefore, to think about investing, to think about businesses, because in the future, we are going to be in a much more complex world. And if you don't think about how you could adapt to climate change, if you don't think about how you could help out in the society that's going to be much more disparate of sorts. If you don't put in good governance in how you run things, you will face serious trouble given that we are going to operate in a much more complex environment than we have seen over the last 1.5 years.
Thank you so much for all your insights. It's been incredibly educational. I hope I've asked all the questions from the chat box. If I have haven't, please feel free to message me, Laura, Xiaowei, anybody from the team, and we will get the questions answered. Thank you, speakers, again, for taking your time to share your insights with us this evening. I'll now pass it back to Xiaowei for some closing remarks.
Thanks, Karishma.
Thank you.
Thank you, speakers, again. So I've personally learned a lot today. And if there's one thing that I've learned, that I've taken away, it's that if we don't consider ESG and sustainability now, we risk becoming obsolete. So companies who are more ESG focused are not only doing good for the planet and also for the people that's living in it, but also for themselves in terms of better performance and profitability, like what James said. So thank you again to our partner, Hsbc, for enabling this evening's virtual discussion and also leading the way in transforming our world into a more sustainable one. And to all of you watching, thank you for joining us during your dinner time to be part of this conversation. I almost said lunchtime. I'm so used to saying lunch. We hope that you're leaving with fresh, actionable insights on ESG and sustainability that will help to guide your lifestyle as well as your business and investment decisions. So as Karishma said, if you have further questions for any of our panelists, you may reach out to anyone on the Tatler team that you know, and we'll follow up with you on this. So a final thing before we end. So Hsbc has prepared an exclusive spa experience for attendees who have agreed to be contacted. So their concierge team has arranged a treatment at the Mandarin Oriental Spa, which, like today's topic, is very much about sustainability and wellness. So the treatment, just to give you a little bit of insight, the treatment you'll be receiving is the Time Rituals treatment, which is a signature of the spa, and it also uses only natural and synthetic-free products. So Hsbc will be in touch with you soon about this. So that's it from us. Until next time, I'm Xiaowei, and it is a good night. Thank you, everyone.